Thank you, Marilyn Stendera, for being here with me for our this episode of the podcast New Voices in Phenomenology. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
My first question is always, if you were to explain what phenomenology is to someone who has no idea, how would you go about that?
Wonderful. It's a great question to think about, especially it's something that I find myself talking about a fair bit when I'm teaching, because even when I don't teach phenomenology, I end up, kind of bringing it into the conversation. And so you always find, well, what's phenomenology 101 in a few seconds. And to me, what always is apparent is that phenomenology is a very broad tradition that takes subjective experience seriously. As you will know from the paper we're reading for this episode, I don't agree with the claim that phenomenology is just about first-person experience or can be reduced to the description of first-person experience. But I do think phenomenology as an area takes personal experience, concern, meaningfulness, motivation seriously. It says that in order to understand what it means to be an organism, to have a world, to navigate a world, we need to take the perspective of the organism seriously, and that we're able to do that as situated organisms ourselves. And if we investigate the structures of those perspectives and the meaning that we make and that we respond to and that we navigate, then we can gain philosophical insights that are not accessible necessarily to other perspectives, especially perspectives that don't take that kind of subjective perspectival meaning seriously. So that to me is something that it might not be entirely unique to phenomenology, but the way that phenomenology takes that seriously and the way it investigates this systematically, rigorously, but always still contextually, that's kind of what defines the discipline for me.
Thank you. So you said the perspective of the organism, which sort of is, it's not a self-evident claim, because, a classical description would rather run the perspective of consciousness, maybe. So anticipating our discussion of your paper, maybe you can say a little bit more about this extended perspective that you are thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to. So yeah, as that point indicates, one of my interests is in expanding the insights of the phenomenological tradition beyond the realm specifically of the human. And that, of course, means, putting myself in tension with a lot of what defines classical phenomenology and even a lot of contemporary phenomenology. And so in having said that, I do think, it is particularly important the structures of human cognition, and especially as human observers and experimenters, human investigators, we need to acknowledge this is the perspective and the context from which we proceed. But yes, I'm very interested in recovering the resources that I think phenomenology has for moving beyond the human. And I think a lot of those resources are there implicitly, sometimes explicitly, in the phenomenological tradition itself, and even the phenomenologists who are perhaps best known for their very strong claims about restriction to the human, phenomenologists like Heidegger. There are implicit resources there for broadening the structures that they limit to the human, and at least kind of telling a developmental story, seeing how, yes, as humans, there are differences between us and other organisms, but we still fit into this broader context of nature as such, and that it's valuable to recover that, especially given, as I talk about in that paper too, phenomenology is in so many wonderful generative dialogues with other perspectives that don't restrict themselves to the human. And in order to further those dialogues, I think it's good to really emphasize and to claim that phenomenology isn't restricted to the human.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we already touched upon a lot of points about your paper, which we are going to talk about, called Explanation and Action and Naturalized Phenomenology. And so the stage you are setting in this paper sort of is that there's this division of labor, as you call it, between the sort of descriptive work that phenomenology is traditionally sort of assigned to, and then the explanatory work, which the natural sciences and the empirical sciences are responsible for. And you also talk about that this goes back in many ways to Dilthey's distinction between explanatory and understanding sciences and so on. And so maybe you can say a little bit more about this distinction and about the ways that you think it should be overcome, and how maybe phenomenology can be explanatory as well.
Yes, thank you. So the distinction itself is, I think, something that we need to problematize and to critically examine, because I think one of the kind of issues in this debate is that a particular version of that distinction has kind of been in play in many discourses without it kind of being really critically examined, right? So this idea that some inquiries just look at describing how things are, which can also include, tasks like understanding and clarifying and drawing out deeper connections beneath the surface. But there is still this idea that description involves looking in a certain sense at a surface level without necessarily examining the mechanisms that might give rise to what we experience. And on the other hand, you have inquiries that are able to explain, that are able to dig down into the deeper substructures and mechanisms which give rise to what we experience. And there is this kind of double sense of asymmetry. Of course, traditionally, explanations are meant to be asymmetrical. There's meant to be a kind of one-way relationship of, a particular mechanism explains, say, the experience it gives rise to, without that being the case in the other direction. Otherwise, you don't have an explanatory relationship. And then there's also an asymmetry between explanation and description, right? Where explanation ultimately is kind of the winner by default if our descriptions clash in some way with the explanations of underlying mechanisms. Then it's the descriptions which are revealed to be illusory, or which are kind of seen as derivative. And so looking at that kind of model of how those tasks are divided, there is still this kind of cliche, I think, this stereotype of phenomenology is about what we experience, which is true, but that it must restrict itself to what it is like to experience this thing, how things seem to us, how they appear to us, without being able to dig down into those deeper levels of underlying mechanisms. And that when we look especially at the collaboration between phenomenology and the natural sciences, which is a collaboration that very few people will deny is productive. But still, when some people talk about how it is productive, it is in terms of, as you said, that division of labor, right? So phenomenology can say lots of interesting things just about describing our experiences, maybe understanding how they hold together, but it's ultimately natural scientific inquiries that tell us about the underlying mechanisms and that are able to truly explain what happens. And so if there is any sort of clash, something in my paper that I call a competition for authority, between phenomenology and the natural sciences, phenomenology must naturally give in. And so overall, as I tried to argue, that this very idea of a competition and a hierarchy and asymmetry, both between the types of tasks, but also between phenomenology and scientific endeavors, is counterproductive. It's not productive for dialogue, and it cuts off interesting resources that phenomenology has to offer. And it also it kind of distorts the philosophical heritage of phenomenology. So I find particularly illuminating, as I say there too, Zahavi's claim that a lot of kind of reductions of phenomenology to description make this mistake of equating phenomenology with the phenomenal. And as he points out, and as lots of other commentators point out, phenomenology has always positioned itself as being about more than this, as not just being about what it is like, as not just being, I think it's it was Sheila who talked about, picture book phenomenology, Bilderbuch Phenomenology, and that it's a much more deeper, rigorous, systematic inquiry, but it's also deeper in terms of the mechanisms it's able to target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And I'm always struck as well if somebody sort of reduces phenomenology to these phenomenal descriptions, because that is, of course, what called the natural attitude, where we just, look at what we experience without, further presupposing anything about it. And instead, of course, the sort of very minimal phenomenological claim would be to talk about the structures of experience. So the sort of, the systematic aspect of what it is not to experience this specific object, but about having the sort of intentional relation to objects at all, and so on. And so in your paper, you approach, or you think about a rapprochement between phenomenology and enactivism. And so if we say that phenomenology is sort of able to think about structures of experience, that is, of course, very important for a field like enactivism, which also very foundationally thinks about how really any kind of organism is related as a cognizer to its surroundings, and how it shapes that relationship between or as a function of the interests of the cognizer. And so maybe you can say a little bit more about how phenomenology and enactivism can come together in this sort of structural perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And that I think is the way you've set this up is already very illuminating. And I think the dialogue between phenomenology and enactivism especially is, it's always going to be shaped by the very fact that, enactivism as kind of a contemporary discourse was influenced by phenomenology from the start, the work of Varela and Maturana that kind of contemporary enactivism has, of course, taken up and builds on. Both of them noted the influence of phenomenological texts, even upon their early biological work. And then, of course, the big book, The Embodied Mind, deals explicitly and extensively with phenomenology. And in the work of much contemporary autopoietic enactivism, there's still a kind of very rich, deep engagement with phenomenology. So it's already there in the DNA of enactivism as a field. But yeah, in structural terms, as you said, I think for me, there are several really important intersections in terms of how each of these discourses sees cognition, sees the organism, sees life. So one thing that always strikes me, one of those perhaps most important interactions, is that enactivism is a relational model of cognition. It's relational both in that, organism and environment collaborate in order to use somewhat very evocative words from recent works, to bring forth a world, to enact a world, so that, you can't think of cognizer or world separately from each other, but you also can't entirely reduce them to each other. There's always this dialogue of responsiveness. And that to me is wonderfully resonant with the way that the subject-world relationship has been portrayed in classical phenomenology and everything, especially Heidegger's early work, which is something that I did a lot of work on for my PhD, being in the world as this kind of counterbalance too of organism and world being intrinsically related, but not reducible to each other. But of course also in the work of pretty much every other classical phenomenologist. And then to me, building off of that, a couple of other key intersections that I think structurally especially bind the discourses together are their shared emphasis on meaning making, right? As you said, cognition is a function of the organism's interests. The way that organisms move through the world, the definition of life as opposed to a non-living system is meaningfulness, being motivated, caring, having the world matter to you, the world being a structure of mattering, which in both enactivism and phenomenology is tied especially, of course, to the specifics of embodiment, the specifics of especially a precarious embodiment. So I've always been struck by the way that both enactivism and phenomenological traditions emphasize finitude, limitations, mortality. For enactivism, life is defined in the face of the potential of annihilation. Life is precarious, just as cognition is fundamentally precarious and mortal and fallible. And all of that, to me, and especially, and this is the last point I'll make, I know my answers are quite long, is that shared emphasis on time and temporality, right? So not only that this is the relationship between cognizer and world is something that unfolds over time, but it's also something that produces time and inhabits time and defines time in particular. So all of these big conceptual structural intersections make, I think, these discourses perfectly well-positioned interlocutors for each other.
Mm. Thank you. And in your paper, you also seize on a couple of specific phenomenological concepts that for instance, what you call motivational causality, which one of its sources might, I guess, be led back to Husserl's ideas too, where he distinguishes between motivation as sort of a causality of mental experience versus the causality of the natural scientific understanding and so on. And so, of course, the dialogue that you are suggesting sort of pushes phenomenology then out of its comfort zone, right? So motivation is not just a matter of the mind anymore, but pertains to the sort of self-concerned interactions of all kinds of organisms in this enactive context. And so one of the interesting points then is that the enactivism, which is sort of concerned with the scaling up, being able to scale up and down the modes of cognition between organisms of different complexities. So that would be something that phenomenology would be drawn into as well. And that would be then the point where we definitely leave the realm of, consciousness and even the sort of modes of what it is likeness and so on, all the classical forms of evidence that phenomenology is looking or seeking after. Can you say a little bit more about this sort of expanded, or as the title of your paper says, naturalized phenomenology? What would that look like if you really were to push this program that you are suggesting? What were some of the consequences, maybe?
Wonderful, thank you. That's a great question. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that, here I see myself as participating in a long-standing, ongoing conversation, firstly about, defining and redefining and challenging what it means to have a naturalistic form of inquiry and what it means to naturalize any form of inquiry. And there's been a great deal of work over that, and especially the past couple of decades, with different challenges to kind of traditional, strict, reductive forms of naturalism. I mean, I think that's already one of the areas in which discourse has benefited from that kind of dialogue between phenomenology and scientific inquiries, and in which each discourse has very concretely benefited from the other. So there's, especially over the past 10 years, been a lot of reformulation of different kinds of naturalism, of liberal naturalism, hybrid naturalism, heretical naturalisms, the arena for that and the stakes for that being set by that kind of dialogue. So it's already this kind of meta-philosophical, meta-methodological gain and generation of insights. And so I see myself as kind of being able to benefit from what other people have done in that arena. And largely a lot of what I want to do is to kind of to draw attention to how much progress has already been made and how many wonderful insights have already been generated. And so yes, in terms of kind of more concrete examples of naturalizing phenomenology, To me, also, that always means that, you know, there is what I call in that paper productive friction, where each discourse has a genuine grip on what the other is doing, and also has a genuine ability to push back, so that neither discourse can say, you know, no, you're not allowed to come into my corner. Here is the stuff I keep for myself. You can't touch this. This is a place where I win and you don't. That there is this kind of radical openness. And the problem that you mentioned, or the notion that you mentioned of scaling up, is for me a particularly productive and suggestive example. So, because this is a problem for essentially both sides. So from the perspective of enactivism, there has been and still is a lot of work of how to explain how these structures of very, very minimal cognition scale up to explain the, you know, extremely complicated cognitive behaviors that, for example, higher level organisms such as humans engage in. And of course, that's a problem for any kind of inquiry into mind, but especially given that enactivism emphasizes, you know, this radical continuity of mind and life, the radical continuity across the spectrum of different organizers. How do we conceptualize, you know, the development of these higher cognitive abilities without just saying, oh, well, some organisms just have more of X, whatever X might be. And on the other hand, for phenomenology, there is, of course, something that we've already touched on, this kind of traditional insistence on phenomenology applying to the realm of the human. And if this is the case, well, how do we conceptualize the relationship between the domain of human experience and the nature within which we find ourselves? And so each side, so to speak, or each interlocutor rather, perhaps a better term than sides, can gain here. I think something I've tried to argue in this paper and other work is that the structures phenomenology analyzes can give us some of the framework and concepts and vocabulary for fleshing out that spectrum of cognitive complexity. For example, if we think of the relationship between minimal and more sophisticated cognizers as being along a spectrum of, say, temporal complexity, existential complexity, motivational complexity, of, you know, the structures that eventually some phenomenologists trace out in humans already having origins and prototypes in more basic cognizers. And on the other hand, when it comes to phenomenology benefiting from these dialogues, there is, of course, you know, generally the benefit of conceptual enrichment, the benefit of relevance, of being able to speak in dialogues that you wouldn't be able to participate in otherwise, the recognition that you have more to say. But one point I make towards the end of the paper is that phenomenology also has the chance to gain even more ways of doing something which it has always done, which is to challenge binaries and to challenge the kind of, you know, the dominance still of the Cartesian ego even further by undermining more binaries, undermining not just what it has always done, the binary of mind and world and mind and body and subject and object and self and other, but also human and non-human, and individual and non-individual, you know, radically challenging as well the kind of the idea that humans are still separate to nature as kind of part of the Cartesian heritage posits. And even pointing to, yeah, these effects of other cognizers on our own cognition, that kind of radically remind us just how embedded in nature we are. As I point out towards the end of the paper, non-human cognizers quite literally feature in human cognition because we are made out of non-human cognizers. And phenomenology, given that it's, you know, it's a radical, flexible, non-orthodox, heterodox tradition. So it stands to gain from being able to do that in even kind of newer, more innovative ways.
Thank you. Yeah, and it would be interesting, for instance, to think about how to downscale something like the internal time consciousness, for instance, and the sort of relationship to temporal objects that could be reframed in other levels of cognition, if you will. Maybe as a last question, a semi-skeptical question, because I think the rapprochement between phenomenology and enactivism presupposes sort of an engaged setting. So we have to be sort of interested in the world, whether we're talking about humans or slime molds and so on. But isn't there in phenomenology sort of a big emphasis also on a completely disinterested perspective? So for instance, in the neutrality modification, so a setting where we are really not engaged in this classical sense and all, and would that fall outside of the purview of this dialogue that you mentioned, or would you say is here a way where this could be accommodated as well?
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And so I'll try to keep my answer short, but I did want to briefly touch on something you mentioned earlier as well, temporality and inner time consciousness. Because yeah, I think that's one especially fruitful area for these kind of dialogues to occur. And as I mentioned, something I've tried to explore in other work too, especially, is this kind of scaling up and scaling down of different structures of temporal experience. I think time, especially the way that meaningfulness, purposiveness, intentionality, time, motivation are related to each other. That is particularly one way in which we can kind of scale down and scale up even the most kind of, specific temporal structures that phenomenology explores. So I think that's especially interesting and promising to investigate further. But yes, absolutely, when it comes to, I think there are lots of grounds for skepticism for looking at these dialogues. And I have to say, this is a particularly interesting problem that you mentioned, because, in one way, we might almost think of this as a problem that comes more from the side of the natural scientific inquiry, right? Where, the kind of the cliche is, oh, look, phenomenology is always about being engaged and contextualized and embedded, and that it can't offer that kind of neutral observation that some natural sciences seek out. And so I think even in that already we find actually this problem is really, there's something more promising in it, because it shows phenomenology too has this heritage, especially of course in the Husserlian project, as you say, of seeking that kind of seeking to distance and disengage itself. So I think, again, this is more of a ground for a dialogue rather than a kind of difference, because really both discourses, both types of discourse, I should say, they are not monolithic, wrangle with this as a problem, right? There's a lot of interesting work in enactivism, especially as it crosses over into cybernetics, of looking at the effects of observation and training participants who are engaged in, for example, empirical studies based on observations of experiences, of how do we disengage ourselves from kind of the immediate natural embeddedness and taking for grantedness of experience, so that, these experimental results shed any kind of light on what we're doing. There's some really interesting work, especially in the kind of discipline that tries to draw on Varela's suggestions of training participants in phenomenological methods in order to help them kind of shed light in these structures, on the structures of cognition. So again, I think that's less of a distinction and more something both discourses share, of course. And one last point, like I said, I know my answers are long, to add to, is that again there are very different conceptions of phenomenology too. So for example, say within Heideggerian phenomenology, the urgency of finding a perspective like that would be less of an emphasis than, say, in a more Husserlian project. So it's interesting too to think how different subtypes of each field could talk to each other in different ways.
Marilyn Stendera, thank you so much once again for being here and talking to me, and all the best for your future research. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been wonderful.